All right, so we are live. Thank you guys for joining us and welcome back to my channel. I am joined by a very special guest, the first ever female Libertarian nominee for President, Joe Jorgensen. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So I'm a progressive, so we're going to agree on a lot when it comes to the military and other things like that and social issues. But there's going to be a whole assortment of things that we also disagree on, which is okay. So I'm going to start on things that we do agree on, and that's a very current topic right now. I saw you actually posted the quote earlier. You don't end riots that were caused with excessive force with even more force. And right now we're in a moment of chaos, which is a really good time for the government to take advantage and expand authoritarian overreach of something like military. And you posted also about the Insurrection Act of 1807 and how Donald Trump wants to send in our military to these local areas without the local areas needing that help. So what do you say to Donald Trump's moves?
Yeah, I think they're wrong, and I think they're going to hurt more than they help. You know, just as we shouldn't be at war with other countries, we shouldn't be at war with our own people. And I think a lot of this was caused by federal government intervention. A lot of people don't realize that the federal government is actually paying for some of these tanks and these other paramilitary items. They're giving them equipment, they're paying for some of their equipment, they're offering free training, and then they've got these joint task forces which put people in more harm's way. So if you think about it, if you're in a town, 50,000, 100,000 people, whatever, or even a larger city, and you went to the taxpayers and you said, okay, we want to raise your property taxes because we want to buy a tank. How many property tax owners would say, yeah, go ahead, raise my taxes. I want my police to have a tank. They probably wouldn't say that. So instead, the federal government takes our money that we don't want them to take. They buy tanks and spend all this money on training. And then they go back to the cities and they say, hey, how would you like this free? Now, of course, it's not free. We paid for it, but it's just we didn't have a choice over it. Whereas if it were done locally, then we'd have a choice. And I just want to add that police are basically a local level service. If you look at burglary, assault, robbery, that kind of stuff, all that's local. There's no reason to have the federal government involved in that.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you look at big cities, usually for every like $300 million spent, 290 million of that goes to the police force. So how do you redirect that? I know Obama made some type of push in some type of way. It wasn't very strong to limit military weaponry to go to police departments, and Trump turned the clock back on that. What would you do?
I would just end it. Obama didn't go far enough. I would just end it. We need to have peace in our country, and we're not going to get peace by giving out tanks. And, you know, there's a psychological effect in that if somebody has a tank lying around or heavy artillery, they're more likely to use it because they have it. Whereas if they didn't have it, then they would have to think of maybe other ways or just not intrude on people's rights so much.
Mm-hmm. It does look like a lot of cops are out there playing soldier. They're bringing out the sonic cannons now to try to dissuade protesters. So what would you do about bloated police budgets?
Well, at a local level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's up to the local government. And one of the problems I think we have is the federal government is getting too involved in state and local issues. For instance, and this is one that I think is one of the most egregious. Back in the 90s, a lot of states had 18 as a drinking age. Many states had that. In fact, I was actually a bartender in college. And so Elizabeth Dole comes along, and as National Transportation Secretary, she would take in money from citizens, and then she would tell the states, okay, you're only getting this highway funding if you raise the drinking age to 21. And so that's why the drinking age is 21 right now everywhere. It's because basically that choice was taken away from the states. And that's not what the founders intended. States were supposed to be able to make their own choices. So as far as the police force, if somebody spends too much money on the police, keep in mind it has to come from somewhere. taxpayers might say, I don't want to pay these high taxes. I'm going somewhere else. And that's actually what's going on in California. There are a lot of people fleeing to Texas, Idaho, and other states because they don't want so much money taken out of their paychecks.
Mm-hmm. I saw many people making a good point calling into the LAPD, saying that these military vehicles that the protesters are like harming or vandalizing are owned by the public, and often cops forget that they're fully funded and owned by the public. And you went into the drinking age a little bit. How do you think the legalization of things like drugs can help the job of a police officer? They don't need as big of budgets as they claim, because they shouldn't be attacking people for doing a drug on their own time or doing something like sex work.
Oh, it would help tremendously. First of all, if there is no victim, there is no crime. If two people choose to, if one person wants to pay for sex and the other one wants to offer it and they both do it voluntarily, that's no problem. In fact, if you want to think about it, that's kind of discrimination against people who are less attractive. What if you're not a good-looking guy and you don't make a lot of money, so you can't take a woman out on a nice date and impress her? What's wrong with paying a woman to do something that's consensual? And the same with drugs. And getting back to what we were talking about, police being militarized. I'm sure you're familiar with no-knock laws, where we have people, policemen in the middle of the night, either dressed in military garb or the opposite end. They're wearing plain clothes, and they, knock on the door at 4 a.m, whatever, and barge in. Well, actually, no knock laws. Like they ram it in, and the homeowner often thinks he or she is being attacked by criminals. And there was a woman recently who was killed in Kentucky, and supposedly there had been drugs used, and it turns out there weren't, and she's dead as a result of that. So what happens if you just happen to rent a home or buy a home that somebody suspected of using drugs? You could give your life for that. And let's say she had the drugs. Let's say she had marijuana. So what? How is she hurting anybody? Drug or alcohol prohibition in the 1920s didn't work, and drug prohibition isn't working now. It's actually the prohibition that's causing more problems than the use.
And for the police departments that are already fully loaded by the militarization, would you want the local governments to decide of a disbursement of those materials? If they already have a tank, would you want the federal government to step in and say you shouldn't have that? Or,
well, first of all, I would encourage. The president does have a bully pulpit. The president doesn't have to just pass laws. I mean, look at the lockdown. The President Trump was up there talking about the coronavirus, how everybody should stay home. He's got Dr. Fauci out there talking about it. And so a lot of states are following his lead. So if I got up there and I said, hey, you don't need the tanks, I encourage you to get rid of them, maybe they would listen. But if any of them are still owned by the federal government, I would take them back. And if there was any way to buy them back from the state, that would be a good idea. But I would hope that a local police force would say, you know what, we can spend the money better somewhere else. And keep in mind, this tends to be a property issues thing. And so a town might say, you know what, we'd rather have a better school. We'd like to build a new high school instead of having this tank, and they can sell it.
And before we get to COVID-19 topics, what would you do overall right now to de-escalate what's already going on in the streets and all the chaos?
Well, first of all, I'd bring all the tanks back to Washington. And I would say it is not the federal government's job. It's not their right to interfere with what local governments are doing. Now, if they're doing something, first of all, if they need help, and if I were president and they asked me for help, I would provide it. If they had gone through every resource and they just had no other option and there was no other choice and they wanted my help, then yes, I would come in and help. Or if somebody's rights were being hurt. So like, for instance, it was pretty famous, Governor Wallace in Alabama, who stood in front of the university not allowing Black students in. And so the government had to step in for that. So for something like that, the government should step in. But is everyday policing, the federal government should have absolutely nothing to do with it.
So that's an interesting topic right there. So when you see them infringing on the First Amendment right now, tear gassing peaceful protesters and sort of making them seem as if they're a part of the riots, would you step in and say, stop doing that? You can't even use these weapons in war because they're banned, obviously. So what would you do with that?
Well, yeah, first of all, I'd like to point out a lot of these problems are caused by rioters, not protesters. And I think one thing that the governments need to do, the state and local governments, is they need to pinpoint who's causing the problem and stop them, and don't punish the protesters, because we do have the right to peacefully protest. So get at who's actually causing the problem. And they can put cameras on drones or do whatever to try to pinpoint who's causing the problems. And what I'm finding is, and if you look on the news, you see these are two different groups of people that basically we have peaceful protests, and then some opportunistic people come in and just hijack the event and use it for their own good. I mean, what does stealing a TV from Target have to do with George Floyd's death? It's just absurd. But people will come in, opportunists who have nothing to do with the movement will come in and find a way to hijack it.
And I'm sure we've all seen the LAPD head chief say that the rioters have the same blood on their hands or whatever as the officers do in the George Floyd murder, which is absolutely ludicrous. But moving on to COVID-19, I know your position a little bit about not making businesses close, but say you're president in the January and February and you're getting the intel that Donald Trump got. How would you have prepared the United States for this? Would it be closing borders or expanding something like testing early, or what would you do?
Right. Well, first of all, I would use my role as it should be used, informational only. Explain to the citizens, here's what's going on. This is serious. You need to take precautions. But I would not take away their individual rights. I mean, this is the largest assault on our individual rights that I've seen in my lifetime. But two things that President Trump did that were wrong is, first of all, lack of testing. And a lot of people don't realize this, but the FDA until 1962 just required companies to prove that their drugs were safe. That's all. After 1962, they had to prove efficacy, that their drugs worked. Now that sounds like a noble thing, you know, well, hey, prove that your drug works. But in order to use the word, and by the way, scientists don't use the word prove, but in order to prove something according to the FDA, you've got to go through rigorous testing, which is why drugs cost $1 billion to develop, which is why we haven't seen the innovation that we've seen in the past. So what I would have done is Emergency Powers Act, drop the efficacy requirement. Right now, if your testing kit is safe, it can be sold, and let the market sort that out. And I'd like to point out there were over 60 companies, that's 60 companies that came up with testing kits that the FDA only approved 2 of them. So that meant all those other companies got to sell testing kits all over the world. So they got the benefit of American ingenuity, and we didn't. In fact, Singapore was one of the first countries to test everybody, to be thorough in their testing. And they were using test kits from our country that even we couldn't use. And the second thing that he did wrong is he stood there in a press conference and said, if you don't have symptoms, you don't need to get tested. And while he was saying that, the experts were saying that that about 60 to 80% of the people with the virus did not have any symptoms at all. So that meant you could have absolutely no symptoms, think that you're fine, and walk out and infect people. So no, we needed more widespread testing.
And he is a pathological liar. So every step of this, he was basically lying. And we didn't know the correct information even without him lying about the stuff we did know. So you say that you're going to give us information. And then you also said you would not force businesses to close after you give them that information because it should be their choice to close.
And we see from the American public, in fact, maybe it was about 6 weeks ago, I saw a survey when they were starting to open up states. And they asked people, do you think it's safe to open up states? Do you feel comfortable going outside? And about 70%, 70 to 80% of the people said, no, it's too early. So they would stay home anyway. You know, we don't need government to be our mommy to tell us to stay home when we're sick or when we could catch something. People were doing that on their own. And just the fact that the overwhelming majority said that they thought that people should still stay home shows that they have good sense about themselves. So, and people who, you know, if we look at who got, who got the brunt of it, it tended to be people who were older, who had pre-existing conditions. So, and by the way, my mother falls into that category, and I've encouraged her, do not leave your house, and she hasn't. So friends and neighbors, you know, are bringing her groceries and stuff. But there's no reason why 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds who test negative can't be out there. What's happened is basically tens of millions of Americans have lost their jobs, and many of them, they're just not getting back.
So what would you have done about certain businesses that did stay open and many of their patrons got sick, and then you couldn't disestablish what we already have as a healthcare system? So that healthcare system becomes overridden right now. Would you step in at that point because everything's overridden and now other citizens are forced to brunt the cost of what they're doing?
Right. Well, first of all, restaurants and stores would probably be concerned about being sued. So they would probably have social distancing on their own and require people to use masks. Because think about it, if you want to earn a profit, if you want to stay in business, you gotta make sure that you don't get sued. So you have to offer good services to the people. And as far as the health service being overridden, why is it overridden? It's because we've got, again, government laws that restrict the number of doctors, restrict the number of hospitals. We've got certificate of need programs in which you can't even build or buy an MRI machine or build a new hospital unless the government thinks that there's a need. Well, how about we just let the hospitals, if they want to build a hospital, fine. And if they go out of business, they go out of business. Why should the government tell people, no, you can't build a hospital?
Yeah, I am a proponent of a universal healthcare system, but I do agree if we were going to do a for-profit method, we need to fix the issues that make things cost so much. Becoming a doctor, getting your certification. We have many doctors doing too many things that nurses could be doing as well that are bloating prices. And there are many issues around that. But as far as testing goes, right away, would you have facilitated some type of race to get more tests out so companies are rewarded, or would you have a government hand helping for that as well, or no?
Well, that's the nice thing about the free market is they get rewarded with profits. So let them work, see who can come up with the best product the fastest, and they will make more money. So it's them working for us, them giving us competition. Now, would you mind if I just made one comment about what you just said? And I guess you don't want to get into the universal healthcare, but I do want to point out that a lot of people who are for universal healthcare don't realize, like you, that we don't have a free market system. I keep hearing politicians saying, obviously the free market doesn't work, so we have to go to single payer. Well, you know what? We haven't had a free market system since World War II, and if we had, it would work much better. So the one message I would love to get across to Americans in my campaign is we do not have a free market system.
Yeah, overall, we don't have a free market. We have absolute corporatism, and I want to talk about that a little bit later. But as far as things like masks, there was a big push that populist left people agreed with and populist right people agreed with, that our masks and things that are a necessity to survival should be manufactured in America. And we should force companies that are producing those in China to come back here, because if the global market crashes like it did with this pandemic, or there's some reason that in China we couldn't get access to those resources, we need to have a fallback option in the United States. Would you be for something like that?
No. First of all, a lot of the reason that companies go overseas is because of our high taxes here. So if we got rid of the taxes, a lot of them would stay here. And also, as far as having masks, again, if let's say all of our masks are made overseas and somehow there's a disruption, then what we need is we need to have all these restrictions gone that keep businesses from going into business to begin with, and let them gear up. And I mean, think about it. You know, even I won't name his name or you know, give him a free ad, but a well-known pillow guy who makes pillows, he turned over part of his production to making masks. So if you've got the incentive out there for companies to do it, they will find a way. And that's what's so wonderful, is necessity is the mother of invention. And so if you allow people to freely decide what to do and let them be rewarded, they will work really hard.
But for systems like, if you want a full free market system, like a full libertarian system, or even a full social democracy, socialist system, it takes a long time to build those. So I want to peer into the libertarian ideology a little bit. If we were at this point in history right now and you just became president, everything is as it is, would you then be willing to go against the libertarian ideology a little bit, just because for the best well-being of people, we were not able to get to that point yet, but you need to make this decision, which is hard for the ideology, but smart for the people?
Yeah, I would never go against libertarian ideology, but I would take it piecemeal. So, for instance, there have been some libertarians who say, you know what, Social Security is gone on day one. And that is immoral and impractical. And it's a horrible thing to do, because you've got, first of all, 12 million people who are dependent on Social Security. You can't just assume they've all got grandchildren who can support them. So what I would do and I'm just using Social Security as an example, but I would do this for pretty much all of the welfare type systems, is first of all, have immediate opt-out, to where if you're in your 20s and 30s and you want to opt out because you know that this is a broken system, immediately you don't have to pay into it. For the people who paid into it 50, 60 years, who are dependent upon it, what I would do is sell government assets, federal government assets like downtown office buildings or mineral rights, and then give them a lump sum and say, okay, here's your money back. Because we all know that their money was not put into a lockbox. It was used to buy stuff. So I'm just going to sell stuff that they bought and give it back to them. So so it would be, we just wouldn't be pulling the rug out from underneath people.
And further on the economy, this is sort of a COVID-19 response question, also added on top of the automation we were already expecting. 15 to 25 million American jobs that we already lost due to this recession are never going to come back due to things like outsourcing and automation and just downsizing in general. I mean, a lot of places are closing down their actual places of business because they know they could telecommute and telecommute better than they were working before. So long term, if there were 40 million, we didn't talk about healthcare that much, but if there were 40 million, 50 million Americans who literally could not work, are you in favor of something which is the most, I think, libertarian way to do this, but of a universal basic income, which is basically like putting gas back into capitalism to keep it running as automation dissolves it?
No, that's the nice thing about capitalism. True capitalism is that you don't need to give it money. People will go out and they will try to create the best product for it. Now, keep in mind, I'm not talking about crony capitalism in which you've got a big government giving big corporations money. I'm talking about true capitalism where you have to work to do a good job for your customers or you go out of business.
But say there's a huge vacuum in the economy that's formed right now and is going to continue. And Amazon and Walmart are looking at what's happening right now and licking their chops because they know that they could just eat up all these small businesses, eat up the marketplace, and take $20, $25 paying jobs an hour and replace it with $12 an hour jobs. And over time, it seems like that would keep on deteriorating to complete monopoly control. So what would your role be in making sure a monopoly doesn't own the United States?
Well, first of all, there are very few, if any, natural monopolies because people always find a way to get in there. So you've kind of asked a multi-part question. I would like to point out that, yes, Amazon and Walmart Online have made huge profit gains from last year, January to March. However, the small mom and pop stores their business was down by like 75%. But if you look, a lot of states would allow Walmart to remain open, and yet the little mom and pop clothing store, they had to close down. So once again, you've got government on the side of big business. And that's usually what happens, because in order to get into office, you need to spend a lot of money. And so you've got lobbyists and special interests. And so we're actually fueled by that. So, that's part of the problem. And I'm sorry, what was the second part again that you said?
It was about, say, Amazon owned at some point 50% of the market share in the United States. Is there a cause for concern there? And if they forcibly took control of too many industries and a competitor couldn't knock that apart, is there a role in antitrust laws?
No, in fact, government has been let's say that that's your goal, that you want to break up big companies. It turns out that the government is lousy at that too. My first job out of college was working for IBM. And that was around the time that all the antitrust, there was an antitrust lawsuit. The Justice Department went after them. And I had a talk with a socialist she was practically, panting. She was so excited. Just like, do you know, if we broke up IBM into 7 different companies, do you know each company would be the size of boroughs, and then boroughs would be able to compete with them? Have you ever heard of boroughs?
No.
Probably not. Exactly. Nobody under the age of, probably 60, maybe 50 has ever even heard of boroughs. So the government tried to break them up. There were reports that if you took all the paperwork in the Justice Department, it'd go to the moon and back. And they weren't able to knock down IBM. But guess who knocked down IBM? 2 guys in their garage who created Apple. So once again, we've got the free market who's able to bust up the large company, the monopoly, and the government couldn't do it.
Mm-hmm. And you don't think that the free market actors are getting smarter and smarter when it comes to competition? Like, say, Facebook literally owns Instagram. If they buy Facebook, Twitter, if they owned all of that and we were stuck in a point of stagnation, there is no point, or is there a point at which government needs to get involved? Or is your answer, no matter how deep it gets, to turn to the free market?
Right, because technology is always changing. I remember back when I did work for IBM in the early 80s, one of my coworkers said, well, you know what? Someday we're each going to have our little phone that we're going to carry around. And I was like, oh, you're crazy. How could that ever happen? And then we get phones. And then, well, first of all, let me go back to the computer. There was some famous, I think it was like the president of IBM. There's a famous quote of somebody saying that computers could never be used practically in the home. Then we get computers in the home. Then we get cell phones. And then we have Facebook. So you never know what invention is coming next that's going to solve all of that or is going to fix it. And again, I love my iPhone. I love my MacBook. We would not have iPhones, MacBooks, and all of these other things if we didn't have the intense competition between Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. They pretty much hated each other, and they were always out to one up the other, which meant that they had to provide a better service at a lower cost. So again, through the free market, we win, because we get people working for us. And, to bring it back to healthcare just a little bit, part of the problem with the healthcare system is, since we don't have the free market, doctors don't have to compete for us. In fact, if you look at the only 2 fields that are somewhat somewhat free market, that would be cosmetic surgery and LASIK surgery. And the reason they're free market is insurance companies don't pay for that. You have to pay for it yourself. So basically, you've got cosmetic surgeons who compete, who have to lower their price, offer better products. And if you look at the graphs, cost of surgery has gone down dramatically in those 2 fields, and quality has gone up. But cost hasn't gone down on, let's say, knee surgery or heart bypass, because the doctors aren't competing. I want doctors to have to compete for my business the same way automobile dealers and computer dealers compete for my business.
And even with competition, you don't see any role in the government in lowering exploitation? Or do you think something like that could be done at a state level? Would you still be for allowing the states to do that amongst themselves?
Like to do what amongst themselves?
Say a vaccine is pumped up in price, or for insulin costs that aren't being controlled and they're being totally extorted way above what their value should be for actual people. Would you be okay with the states making legislation on their own?
But what we find is that in a free market, prices go down. You know, look at how much computers went down because we've got different people competing for your business. Look at, as I mentioned, LASIK surgery and cosmetic surgery. Nobody had to put price caps there because they competed with each other. And I'd like to mention two other cases here. If you don't mind, I'm gonna look up some numbers that I have handy here. So first of all, if you look at Singapore is a group or is a country that I think has a good system because it is competitive. And they've got the state of Indiana, the state workers, they have a system that's very similar in which people are in charge of their own health dollars. And they go out and whatever they don't spend, they get to save. And what was really interesting is the first year that they started this, something like only 10% of people use generic drugs. And we keep saying how people should use generic drugs because they're cheaper. And most people don't. Why? Because what does it matter to them? The insurance company is paying for it. And that's a problem with universal healthcare system. Now, in Indiana, when they set up a system in which people were in charge of their dollars, within like a year or two, the number of people using generic drugs went from 10% to 90% because they got to keep that money. You know, think about it. Does it make sense for you to shop around when you buy a car or if you buy gas for your car? Yes, because you get to keep the savings. That's what we need in healthcare. Now, the second thing is, let me mention, so over in Singapore, where doctors have to compete, where all the prices are out there, and they don't have the type of insurance we have here. Heart bypass here costs $130,000. A heart bypass in Singapore costs only $18,000. So you're saying in a free market system, are we going to have controls? That's the whole point of the free market, is that the free market, that's the control, that people, in order to get your business, have to give you a lower price. And that's why heart bypasses are only $18,000 in Singapore and $130,000 here.
But if there's only one place that's allowed to manufacture something and they have the patent for something like insulin, what would you be for doing? Would it be opening trade to the global market? Because I think that's something that could make free market healthcare, if it was possible, more appealing.
Well, of course, we believe not only that you should be able to buy and use recreational drugs, we believe you should be able to buy medicinal drugs, drugs required for your health. So one problem that they've got going, and I believe that patents are a good thing, but they need to be limited. So you're not going to have anybody out there trying to come up with a new drug if they spend millions in research and development, and then they come up with a new drug and somebody else just steals the formula. So you need to give them a window in which only they are allowed to sell. So the window should be maybe a little shorter. But here's what's more important, is what we have right now is somebody comes up with a drug, they patent it. And then what they do is they make a little change that makes no difference at all. And then they say, okay, so we're extending our patent because this is a new drug. And then they do it again and again. And that's wrong. You know, if you're changing, if you've got a pill that does the same thing, and now instead of being yellow in color, it's blue in color, you know, or green in color, you can't say, okay, we get to extend our patents. But again, you look at insulin, look how cheap it is in Mexico. If we didn't have the insurance companies giving people unlimited dollars, then we wouldn't, you know, we'd see lower prices, just like other countries have lower prices. And can I mention one other thing about insurance companies? So a lot of people think, well, it's up to, you know, the insurance companies have a vested interest in holding down prices. Well, only a little bit, because, yeah, they're not just going to pay out all the claims willy-nilly. But here's the secret that people don't realize is in order for insurance companies to grow and be more profitable, they have to give out more claims. What they have to do is they have to give out enough claims that the next year they can raise their premiums so they make more money. So then the next year they have to approve even more claims so they can raise premiums the following year. So actually, it is not in the best interest of the insurance company to hold down costs. It's in their best interest to have to keep spending more money.
Mm-hmm. I think the differing ideologies have something very much in common between us when it comes to keeping government and how everything acts clean. So I want to ask you a little bit about how we keep campaigns clean. What do you think about different campaign financing laws? Should they be all publicly funded? Do corporations count as a voice? Because as a progressive, my biggest goal isn't to get rid of government. It's to make sure government is owned by us, because I believe that we do not only need negative freedom from government, but I think we need positive freedom on top of that, which is where we agree on. But what do you think about different campaign finances?
Well, first of all, that's funny. When you said you wanted to keep things clean, I thought we were going to go to the environment. But my ultimate goal is that government plays such a small role that you don't care about campaign finance or who gets to donate, because, you know, and a lot of people are saying, well, why is it so contentious now? Why are we so divided? It's because basically you have to go through the government for everything. A lot of people don't realize that back in the 30s and 40s, there were a lot of corrupt people in Congress, you know, probably more corrupt than today, but people didn't care because it was such a small part of their lives. But now, if you want your kid to go to a school that either says the pledges of allegiance or doesn't have religion or whatever, you got to go in there and you got to, you know, fight the school board, fight the government. If you want a different kind of a health care, you got to go in, you got to fight the government. I mean, basically the government is involved in everything. So if we let people keep their money to where if you want school with religion, you get it. If you want school without religion, you get it. But right now, you've got to get in there and fight to get your way, because government always gives you a one-size-fits-all. In fact, that's even worse now because we've got the Department of Education, which sets standards for the entire country. And, you know, rural Appalachia, they may have different values, different things they want to teach than like downtown Manhattan. So why shouldn't they be allowed to? But instead, people have to worry about government because they have to go to the government for all their needs. So if we got government so small, it would be like, who cares if you vote? Because with such limited powers, it wouldn't matter.
Well, we both agree on one thing. We would rather no government than bad government, for sure. But I have you for about 5 or 8 more minutes, 5 to 10, whatever. I wanted to talk a little bit about third-party politics. I interviewed about a week ago Howie Hawkins, the presumptive nominee for the Green Party, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about what you think are some misconceptions about the Libertarian Party, because I feel like both the Green Party and Libertarian Party are looked at and kind of thought of as too small or goofy. So what would you like to tell people about the Libertarian Party?
Well, the big thing is a lot of people lump us with the other small parties, but we are consistently on the ballot in all 50 states. Not every year, but we are definitely the third party. And we're in the ranks with the Democrats and Republicans in that everybody has a chance to vote for us in the entire country. So first of all, I would say that we're in a different class than they are. And by the way, I sat next to him in a debate in Chicago last March. So yes, I met him. And I would say that people's misconception is, well, can you tell me any specific misconceptions that you're thinking of?
Well, they see who I think is a great guy, Vermin Supreme, and they see a couple of libertarian debates where they want to abolish things like driver's licenses and things at the local level that I think there's a 99% consensus that should be there. So people see those videos, they see people saying we should abolish the government entirely, and they think, well, these people are unrealistic.
Okay. And yes, that is unrealistic. You need to have law and order on the roads. So, you know, do we need driver's licenses? It's up to the person who owns the roads. And right now that's the government. So absolutely, they can require driver's licenses. And in fact, I don't think that they're strict enough with DUI. I mean, we hear about repeat offenders, people who kill people being let out time and time again. So I am absolutely for law and order when it comes to saving people's lives on something like a road in which we don't have the free market, where we can say, well, you know, this company over here does their road much better than that company. Right now, we've got the government. And I would say that what we want is we want to go back to what the founding fathers wanted. When they set up government, they specifically set it up so that we had part-time legislators, you know, the citizen statesmen, to where you would go to Washington, serve a few months, and then you would go home and live under the laws you just passed. But that's not what we have. We've got professional politicians who are like royalty. And, you know, there's an interesting, and I wish I could remember the politician's name. This was, you know, back in the 70s, 80s, whatever, before we had, you know, the 24-hour news cycle. But he was a Democrat who passed laws outlawing discrimination, to where you couldn't discriminate on sex, race, creed. And then somebody suggested, well, you know what? We should have those same laws for Congress. And he kind of puffed up his chest and said, I should be able to hire whoever I want. So he passes a law that says other people have to follow, and then he doesn't want to follow it. So we need to get back to a time when the politicians have to live under the laws that they create.
Mm-hmm. So tell me if I'm getting this right. So if it can't be solved by the free market, you're okay with things like local law enforcement to keep people safe at a base level, at a communal level, and then you are not okay with the federal government overextending the military in any instance, whether it's domestic or abroad.
Oh yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Well, yeah, first of all, libertarians believe in police, courts, and military. So for the government. So yes, absolutely have the government have a military. Absolutely have the government run, you know, police departments. And yes, have them run the courts. But I'd like to talk about bringing the troops home briefly, which is I'd like to turn America into one giant Switzerland, armed and neutral. Right now, we've got troops all over the world that are creating more problems than they're causing. We're helping to support wealthy Europe. There's no reason why, you know, poor people here should have their tax dollars go to pay for a military for France or Germany. Let them pay for their own. And also in the Middle East, we are causing more problems than we're solving being there. We need to just leave and not give them a reason to go after us. And that's the irony, is the job of a military is to keep its citizens safer. And what the military has been doing is putting us into more danger.
So I have to ask you about this now, since you brought up something global. But what's your stance on the Israel-Palestine situation?
Again, not our country.
Just leave it. Stop giving Israel funding at all.
Well, stop government funding. If individuals choose to fund, absolutely, it's your money. You have the right to do what you want with it. So if you want to send money over there, that's perfectly fine. But there's no reason for the government to take your money and spend it in a place where you don't want it.
All right. Well, I had you for about 45 to 50 minutes around that time. So tell people a little bit about yourself, why they should vote for you, and where they can find you.
Yeah, first, please come to joj2020.com, joj2020.com. And I've got a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. I teach at Clemson. So you mentioned earlier about maybe people have the misconception of IBM, or not IBM, about libertarians being kind of on the fringe. I mean, I'm teaching college students. I've got a husband, I've got kids, and I've been a longtime libertarian activist. And I've worked in the business community, as I mentioned, for IBM, as well as academia. So if you wanted a woman academician and you didn't get Elizabeth Warren, you can turn to me.
All right, that's great. Well, thank you for joining me for this conversation. It was great, even though we disagree on a lot of things. There were a lot of places that we could agree on.
Oh, of course. Yes, I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Yep. Have a great rest of your week.
You too. Thanks so much.